Hi, and welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having positive conversations with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Stephen Frost, executive producer at Digital Eclipse, and formerly a senior editor for PlayStation Magazine, or PSM, the 100% independent PlayStation magazine, and formerly a producer at Sega. Hi, Stephen. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, Stephen. Thanks for asking, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your early Sunday morning and letting me steal the time and talk to you.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure. Always glad to chat with folks about games and making games and things like that. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you're happy to be here, and again, the pleasure is all mine. So thank you so much. Now, Stephen, before we get started, if you don't mind, maybe telling those who are listening about yourself, so that way we have a better idea of just who you are.
Sure. I normally have this long just story about how I got into the games industry and things like that, but I've started to truncate it a little bit more for the savings of time. So I'll probably do that here. But I've always kind of been interested in games since I was young. It's sort of the classic story. Grew up on consoles and PCs. I was early on. I was predominantly a PC in the early days of PC gaming, when you had less than 16 colors on on a screen, and played a lot of sort of Sierra games and things like that. And moved on to the Amiga before sort of jumping into consoles too. And just grew up well surrounded by games. A lot of my friends played games. I knew a lot of folks who played games, and so it's always been sort of part of my life. As have been sort of computers. And so going through high school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life, I spent a lot of time learning about computers and HTML and website design, and just as much as I could sort of take in. But I enjoyed doing that, so I never really thought about it as a potential career going into college. So I ended up like trying a variety of different other fields, sciences and classes that would eventually lead me into the medical field and things like that, but just wasn't happy with anything. Just through just a circumstance and luck, next to the college that I was going to at the time, the University of Oregon, almost across the street actually, was a studio called Dynamics. And for those who don't know Dynamics, from way back in the day, they were a very big PC developer. They were owned by Sierra, which obviously was the big Roberta Williams company that did King's Quest and games of that ilk. So I went over there and they were hiring QA positions. And I thought, oh, well, this sounds like a fun job to do while I'm going through college. Hopefully they'll like me and hire me. And so I went in during lunchtime and sort of applied, and they just kind of gave me this multi-page test. I can't remember what it was, like 4 or 5 pages, I think. And it was a lot of technical computer questions, and along with what I thought were very easy, just general questions about PCs. And filled it out quickly, didn't think much of it. I handed it over to them, and they looked at it and said, "Oh, wow, this is great. You're knowledgeable about PCs. You understand games. How about can you start tomorrow as a QA person?" I'm like, "Oh, wow, okay." That was a very fast turnaround. And so I'm like, "Sure, why not?" And so next day come in, and as that's the first day of sort of my career in games, and I spent time testing a variety of PC games back then. I tested some hardware. Microsoft was just introducing the Sidewinder controller for the old folks who remember the first iterations of the Sidewinder controllers, but we got some of the first ones to test, and so I kind of helped with that. And slowly, just because the development teams and folks were there in the building, I got to know a lot of the different disciplines who worked on games, started contributing a little bit to design and production and things like that, and got really interested in the whole idea of creating and working on games. Unfortunately, being in Oregon, there weren't many options for games development there. There was a company called, I think, Pipeworks, which I think is still around actually. And there was Trilobite Software, which worked on and created Seventh Guest and the 11th Hour, which were huge CD-ROM games back in the time. But aside from that, there wasn't really much. And so I knew I sort of had to get to California or Texas. Those were the two hotbeds of game development at the time, and interviewed and didn't have much luck as far as game development, mainly because during that time folks didn't really hire out of state. Why would they have resources and folks in state and would prefer to lean towards that. And so I kept sort of like coming across as like, well, we like you, but you're in Oregon, and we'd rather deal with someone who's a little bit more locally. So I kind of took a different path and said, well, I want to get to California in some way. And I chose California just because it's closer to Oregon. And should I fail miserably, I can, make my way back to Oregon and to my family, in disgrace and shame if needs be. It wasn't as far away as Texas. So I was determined to get to California, no matter what. And while I was working at Dynamics, I read a lot of video game magazines such as Next Generation and Game Players Magazine, and got to know the company that published those, which was Imagine Media at the time. And so I thought, well, maybe I can get through to California in some other way, and then sort of make my way back into games development. So through a variety of trying and persistence, I actually landed a job in California for Imagine, working as sort of a webmaster slash writer for the websites. And for those who don't know, Imagine was the start of IGN, which is still around today. If you know the IGN network. At the time when I started, though, it was a variety of separate websites focused on different consoles, and we had not unified it into IGN yet. So I started working on websites. I started contributing to writing on the website, just because I was also into fighting games. I got asked to start reviewing fighting games for some of the magazines and helping out in the magazines. And so I got a little bit more experience writing and getting comfortable with how to review games, and continue that for a little while. And that sort of really sparked my interest. I enjoyed that process of creativity. I was getting at that time, a little burnt out at website stuff. And, one of my final tasks was, starting to come up with the general idea of what would become IGN. But during that time, the editor in chief, Chris Slade of Game Players, or Ultra Game Players at the time, asked me if I wanted to help start up a a new PlayStation magazine. And so I sort of jumped at that chance, and that's where PSM came from. And that was a great, very exciting time of my life. I learned a lot about games. I learned about what made good games, what made bad games, and whatever was in between. And so I stored a lot of that knowledge, knowing that eventually I would try to get back into games development. But it was a wonderful time. I was in my 20s. I got to travel around the world. I got to see a lot of, different games. I got to talk to a lot of people in the industry and learn a lot. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful time. But I knew, like I said, that I wanted to get back into games. So about 6 or 7 years later, I was sitting at my desk and kind of came to this epiphany. I said, well, now's the time. I should probably get back into games before I start to get too old, and it becomes difficult. And so I did. I jumped ship from PSM, which was a painful transition because I loved that job. It was a wonderful, wonderful job. I still fondly look back at that job as one of my, greatest times of my game-related career, because it was basically just a bunch of friends hanging out, talking about games, and sharing our enthusiasm and our love of games with the world, and it was a blast. Um, so I jumped ship and I went over to EA, where I started working with sort of external developers at EA at a group called EA Partners. And then went over to Activision, where I started working on superhero and Marvel games. This was the sort of the start of the genesis of the resurgence of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the sort of transition into making good superhero games, basically. And from Activision, I ended up at Sega, where I also continued working on a variety of Marvel games, and ended my time there for the last like 3 years or so, working on Sonic the Hedgehog IP in general across a couple of games. After that, you know, Sega, I think I attribute to a bit to the success of Sonic, but decided to move down to Southern California to get closer to Hollywood and licensing and things like that. You can see that sort of paid off now, where we've had a couple of Sonic the Hedgehog movies that have been very successful. So it made sense for them But a lot of us didn't, had our roots in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and didn't want to move, and so we stuck around, um, as I did. And I took that time just because the last 3 years working at Sonic at Sega were challenging and tough and very stressful. I decided to sort of step away and take a break from games for a little bit, for like a year and a half, just to sort of rejigger, myself, get excited about games again, spend some time doing things that I've wanted to do, and just enjoy life for a little bit. And about a year and a half into it, I said, well, okay, I've had my chance to sort of relax, take a step away from the hustle and bustle of the industry. I'm excited and rejuvenated to sort of start again. And a couple of folks who I used to work with during the editorial days when I was at PSM, they worked on other magazines, but were at the same company. Worked at a studio in Emeryville, California, called Digital Eclipse. And since I knew them, I started chatting with them. They were working on, at the time, were about to work on a collection of Street Fighter games. And fighting games have always been a love of mine, and it sort of clicked. And so I sort of came on board, and my first project there was the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. And I've been there ever since. And it's just again, it harkens back to my editorial days. It's a bunch of friends having fun, enjoying themselves, working on games and projects that we love, and I can't complain. So that's where I've been, and that's where I am today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, how you got from point A to point B. Um, I there was a lot there, and I don't mean that in that you said a lot, and just meaning the how you got from point A to point B. Starting at school, wanting to look at science, medical, and then I don't want to use lucking into more. I don't know the right way to phrase it, but
Sure.
sort of stumbling. Let's go with stumbling into QA
Yeah.
at Sierra, just because, as you said, um, they gave you a hiring packet or a test or what have you. You filled it out immediately and just sort of went, well, there you go, have fun, and they wanted to hire you right away, which is you know rather amusing because I imagine back then, especially the um, the field of people that would be um, I don't know if qualified is the right word, knowledgeable, technically knowledgeable, or what have you, for that genre or what have you, would have been quite small. So I imagine they were quite happy that you just sort of stumbled in on a whim into their studio or into their office or what
Yeah.
have you.
Pretty much.
Um, and then moving to magazines, and then bouncing to Sega, and a few other places, and now landing at Digital Eclipse, where you guys are. I don't want to say emulating, but you're um,
No, no, it's
preserving.
fine. We do. Yeah, I mean, emulation is definitely part of it. We don't always do that, but it's definitely a key part of it. So yeah, have no qualms saying emulation.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you. That makes it a little easier for me. Um, but like just how you got there. That's really interesting. I always love hearing how people get from point A to point B, just because it's never the same. And in my mind, I don't want to say validate, because no one needs validation for how they get from point A to point B or what have you, but like in my mind it always strengthens, I guess, that you don't have to wake up one day, say I'm going to work in the industry, go to school for like something very specific, and then just you follow that path. Not to say that is
Right.
a wrong way to do it, because there is no wrong way, but it's just great to hear that there's always so many ways that people just find themselves doing what they love.
Yeah, I mean, and especially back then, I there weren't as really any sort of resources or schools that were going at the time. I mean, eventually, DigiPen up in Canada was one of the first schools that had programs that were associated with video game development. But predominantly, you couldn't go to any university in the United States really and say, "Oh, I want to make games. What is the course path that I need to sort of take?" And so that's changed quite a bit now. There's a lot more places that do have programs in place specifically for art, animation, design, and things like that. So there's a lot more resources for folks. But you had mentioned this, and there is a bit of luck and timing in a lot of ways with this. One of my jobs I got in the industry was purely based upon um, my hiring boss opening up email, and mine was the very first email, and so they reached out to me. So I hate to say it's all luck, but there's no doubt that there are components in folks' careers that come down to a little bit of luck and timing, for sure.
And yeah, and like I'm never I never don't I wow, let me try and think of how I want to phrase this. I never go out of my way to try and like shy away from the luck aspect just because luck is a very valid thing and it's something that happens to everyone. And I think some people might want let me phrase that. Um, I believe that some people will hear the term luck and think it's a negative connotation, or just that you didn't earn your ability in there. But the reality is, like, you were prepared, and all of the everything along the way you were doing right. You were setting yourself up for it, and the luck aspect isn't that they just went, okay, we'll give this person on a whim. It was that you were in the right place at the right time, and that you were the person they needed, and everything just fell in line, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly. Exactly. I mean, along those lines, it's like you have to be prepared and you have to have the enthusiasm and sort of the knowledge and willingness to do it. I mean, we sort of say luck, and maybe that's just a specific door opening for you, but you can't. You still have to have sort of the drive, the ambition, and the knowledge and the desire to get through that door. I guess is what I'm saying.
exactly, exactly, yeah. Now, Stephen, typically I would ask how how you got into developing and making games. However, you talking about who you are and what you do and all that, you kind of covered that, and we kind of covered all that. So I don't want to beat a dead horse, so to say, and try and make you reiterate what you've just said, because that would I think that would just do a disservice to what you just said. However, based on the experience, your experiences of how you got here, do you maybe have any advice for those seeking to get into the industry?
Sure. I mean, like I said earlier, there are quite a few colleges now in the United States and Canada um, that have at least, 2 year or so programs focused on sort of specific aspects of game development. Not everything, but definitely things like art, animation, and design for sure. They're now starting to have some programs dedicated to sort of music design and things specific to games. Actually, those are starting to crop up. So one way is definitely to go through and spend some time in those programs. And what that sort of helps is twofold: is it actually will determine if you actually like that specific area of game development that you're pursuing, right? Because there's nothing worse than trying to get into a gig or a job and then you find out that maybe this isn't the right path. And I've seen people do that. I've seen several people who have come up, let's say through QA, and gone into production and the harsh realities of what production is and the challenges and stuff, and just say, this is not for me. I want to move over to something, to music or something else. So there's nothing wrong with that. So universities and colleges with programs dedicated to game development is definitely one way. If you don't have access to that, then I would say whatever area that you are focused in, start to create some examples of that. If you are an artist, then definitely start putting together a portfolio. I would probably mix that with not only original stuff, but maybe some art inspired by games or that you enjoy or some of your favorite games to sort of have a connection point to game development. Same thing with animation and things of the sort of art side of stuff. Having a nice portfolio for sure, and also being able to talk to in interviews what games you like the art for and why do you like the art for it. So understanding that sort of component is great. I also sort of suggest there are a myriad of game engines now that are freely accessible for people, especially students, at no cost because obviously you're not selling the end product. So you have the Unities and the Unreals. You even have like Game Maker if you want to try to make older school sort of retro games that can even work on a Nintendo Entertainment System. But there's a variety of game engines out there that are not crazy difficult to learn, and a lot of them already have assets created with them that you could utilize. So one possible direction is to do that. And what's great about that is that if you can put together a small scope game or even a demo of sorts, you can show that you have a very broader understanding of game development in general. And while you may want to focus on art or animation or some specific field like that, being able to put together uh, a demo or a small example of a game experience just shows that you not only understand the different components, but are able to sort of work with them and create something interesting out of them. So that's something I highly recommend because it's really just a time thing. There's tons of documentation and support online for a lot of these engines. There's forum support. With the growth of indie developers, you have a lot of people going through and solving the same problems as you. So there's a wealth of knowledge out there. So that's obviously kind of another way to do it. The thing that I brought up earlier, which is a typical way, is going through QA. QA, while most people sort of view it as sort of this unattractive or unexciting aspect of game development, it is actually very, very important. Um, People who go through QA, as I have, learn a tremendous amount about game development. A lot of the things and the thinkings and the beliefs that you have when just playing games outside the industry really, you know, you start to sort of break those apart and really understand how game development works and why decisions are made the way they are, and what sacrifices are made in order to choose one feature over another feature. And these are discussions when I was in QA, even early on when I was in QA, and I started really understanding this stuff and having these countless sort of discussions and arguments with my friends who were not in the industry and didn't understand why games were the way they were. And I would just sit there and have to articulate, well, this feature was chosen for this reason, and they had to sacrifice this and this, right? So there's choices that have to be made. And the biggest lesson really that you pick up is that almost anyone can make a great game if you have enough time and you have enough money, right? But that's not the challenge. The challenge is making the best game you can within the constraints of time and money, staffing, and limitations like that. And these are the things that you sort of learn going through, and especially in QA, because you sort of see where the problems are, and you can learn a lot from there. And during your time at QA, you have some time to really figure out what field, if you're still interested in game development, what field or path you want to take down. So I would still say, and it's a classic thing, that QA is a great sort of path to take if you are trying to figure out what you want to do in games. You want to learn more about how games are made, and kind of go from there. So that's at least two or three different areas or ways that I would suggest getting into games. Persistence for sure. Another way is, you know, um, is networking. It's networking is the classic cliched thing, but the more people that you can get to know, that you talk to in this industry, and make yourself known that you're available to help out or be hired, the better, right? A lot of people, just because of time constraints and stuff, it's not laziness per se, but let's say they need an artist, a junior artist or something like that, and they need it really quickly. The pain of having to go out and work with HR and set up a listing for a job, and sort of vet through various people who have submitted resumes and art samples, it's a very time intensive thing, and it's a lot of work. Which is why, like, if someone knows you and you're like, oh yeah, I remember, Sarah, and she had quite a great bit of art. Maybe I can just reach out to her and just have her work on some stuff and see how it goes. And that's so much easier and a very low cost of entry for them. So that's why I say networking, is important. If you can, go to events, go meet people. There's a variety of sort of events in the U.S., from conventions to things like GDC and stuff like that. If you're in the area, but getting to know and meet people in the industry, ask them questions about them, become a known sort of entity, especially, is really helpful because, like I said, if they know you, there's a greater chance of them reaching out to you and seeing if you can participate or help with a project. So hopefully that's at least a few different ways that I suggest folks try, and hopefully will help them gain a little bit easier entry into the games industry in the field that they want to pursue.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that advice. For for you gave a few different ways to go about it, so thank you for that. And I'm sure, um, like no matter how you look at it, anyone that would potentially listen and be looking for maybe some direction, I'm without a doubt positive that that will be, that'll help them, and especially the networking portion, just because I think it's important to note that regardless of your industry, networking always seems to be key. And it's probably a good thing to learn how to do because, as a lot of people may or may not know, networking isn't an easy thing. It takes, you have to learn how to do it and you have to put yourself out there and all the other fun things surrounding it, not to hand wave it, but just for the sake of a whole huge topic. But yeah, I think that's also a really important thing that people should focus on learning how to network and just networking, right?
Exactly. And it's always, I mean, it's stuff I had to do. I'm generally a very introverted person, and I just made it a conscious effort to, in general, in my life, to be very outspoken and out there in front to sort of overcome that. And so, especially in the early days, networking and talking to new people was always very tough to me. I was always seemed like that guy who was standing in the corner with a very sort of sour face, and it wasn't because I was sour, it's just that I was sort of uncomfortable and didn't want to chat with people and things like that. But I eventually felt I had to overcome it. It's one of those cliche things where, like, if you want change in your life, then you have to make changes. And so I eventually overcame that. I got, and this was even during my editorial days, sort of overcome that and got a lot more confident. Made a very proactive effort to engage with people. If they needed a speaker for something, be that speaker, that public, facing speaker, and just work harder and harder and harder to overcome that. And it makes a difference, right? It instills confidence in you, and it makes the next time that you're trying to meet someone that much easier. But like you were saying, it is networking is a tough thing. It is an important thing though, and but I will say though, if you get to know people, it is so much easier for them to reach out to you than pursue other paths. So it is worth the investment. It may not lead you to your dream job all the time, but I'm pretty sure in the end it'll be a net positive for you.
Again, I thank you for that because yeah, I believe that's also a great point. And just thank you for that advice because I hope anyone that listens to it that might be on the fence, especially about networking, takes that to heart because like I said, I believe it's a very important thing to do. Not that I do it, not that I'm good at doing it, but it's still like you said, you learn from it and you learn how it can benefit you once you start doing it. So hopefully people take that to heart, and those that are apprehensive just throw themselves into it.
Yeah, for sure. There's no easy way to do it. You just got to take that first step.
So now, Stephen, I want to go back a little, and this for you, it might be a little further back than most people are aware of, just based on um, where you said you started with games. But you know, what was your favorite game as a child, or or games, and what really made you enjoy that, or those games, or enjoy it, or what have you?
Right, sure. So, as with a lot of people, I went through sort of stages of games and interest as I kind of grew up. In my earlier years, say, let's say elementary years, elementary school years, I was very much into PC games and the Sierra games. So the things like the King's Quests and Colonel's Bequest and Police Quest and a lot of those quest games, Space Quest, where it was the classic, design of where you navigate your player around, your character around, and you type in, what you want it to do. And I think what charmed me about that is that the text interface or being able to enter felt like it allowed me like a lot more options. Like I wasn't constrained by, even though you sort of are, but you don't feel this. You're not constrained by what the game developer is doing, right? You feel like, oh, I can type almost anything in here and it will happen. And so I can play this game the way that I want to. Um, that sort of freedom combined with the puzzle solving, and sort of the art really enamored me with those types of games. And so I was a big lover of the the Sierra games throughout the existence of that company all the way until they kind of fizzled out many years later. Along those lines, I think it also kind of captures my enjoyment of the sort of typing in and figuring things out were the Infocom games, which were a variety of text-based games, right? No art or anything like that. They were literally text-based games like Zork and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and things like that, where you're just presented with text and a cursor, and you had to just type what you wanted to do. And so, what was great about those games is that you had to fill in a lot of the world with your imagination because you didn't really have anything. What was neat though is that those games all included little props with them that helped to sort of add to that immersion of imagination. So, little items that came from the books, if they're based off of books, or what protects you from the world. And so it was kind of cool to see what the games included, what little knickknacks or what little fun little items were included in that. And so I really, really loved those types of games in elementary school for sure. During that era where your imagination is rampant and you love sci-fi and sort of games of that ilk. Um, and that sort of continued, and I got bit more into sort of action games and things like that once I got into consoles like the NES, or when I got introduced to the Amiga 500, which is still one of my favorite gaming platforms ever. It was such ahead of its time. And so those were the type of games during elementary school per se. As I got a little bit further into high school, I still enjoyed those games, but they started making less and less of those. And I sort of transitioned more into sort of platforming games. Obviously, Mario had long come out and the variations and sequels thereof, and games similar to that. So I was big into action platforming games, and that is still carried forward to this day. I love very much the classic, what I call N64 era of action platformer games. And it's a dying genre, and most people don't do it anymore. For sure. I mean, I think Balan Wonderland was probably one of the last ones had in time recently that captures sort of that era of puzzle solving and platforming. Ukulele. So those games have always been, well loved by me and a special place in my heart for sure. And any sort of game similar to that, the Mario 64s, the Donkey Kong 64s, or the Banjo Kazooies, and the games of that sort of type, I will support wholeheartedly because I just love that aspect um, of puzzle solving and platforming and just going around a world or a level and trying to figure out what to do. So that's always been a big genre of mine. And then when I got into the latter part of high school, and especially into college, fighting games, it was the heyday of arcade-based fighting games. Obviously, the Street Fighter 2s come out, Mortal Kombat's, and a variety of other Neo Geo games. Obviously, Art of Fighting, Samurai Showdown, and things like that. So those latter years of high school and all through college, and even to this today, fighting games have always been a huge thing for me. I love them. I have a Virtua Fighter 2 arcade cabinet right sitting next to me here, as well as a Street Fighter arcade cabinet. So I still play those games quite a bit. I think that's probably why I got hired at Digital Eclipse to do the Street Fighter collection, quite honestly. But anytime there's a new fighting game, I love to play them. I don't do the competition stuff anymore. I don't get to that nuanced level anymore, but I still enjoy them. Play them quite a bit. And so and that's always sort of resonated. Going back to sort of the action platformers, given that they don't really make those that much, over the last decade or so, 15 years, I've also sort of transitioned into the closest thing to that, which is sort of the third person action adventure games, right? Like the Uncharted, the Tomb Raiders, um, the Last of Us, and things like that, where you're going around and you're exploring a world, and there's navigation puzzles, and there's action sequences and story cinematic sequences. Those have sort of filled the empty space, I guess, of where the classic action platformers have gone. And so I still am a big fan of those. I was a huge, and still am a huge fan of God of War and the classic God of War games. So those are probably the three genres that I still, now enjoy. Um, but it all started out with these, with this love for these type, keyboard interface kind of games like from Sierra.
And thank you for sharing that, and that's always great to hear. Just coming up from, I'm a little younger than you based on the consoles or the PC units that you mentioned, but I did have a similar trajectory in some way or form. Where my father introduced me to early Sierra games. Um, Inappropriately Leisure Suit Larry at a young age, and he's going to
No,
listen to this
yeah. Yes.
and he's going to listen to this and wonder why I'm calling him out. And it's because, I don't think an 8-year-old should have been playing Leisure Suit Larry, but, live and learn.
Right.
Um, but no, but playing other King's Quest games or Police Quest or Space Quest, like, starting there and then, moving around to playing with some fighting games. I can't speak too much to them in the same way that you could, just because it was, for me, it was never something that clicked too well, but I was always impressed and in awe by the people that it did click with. And I mean that on the sense of, like, if you look at, real high level technical players for some of the more technical games or arcade ones or what have you, um, it's it's always a, it's always awesome to watch, just because, it's fantastically high level in what people are doing and trying to, having to know what the options are that are going to come at them. So, I can definitely appreciate those games, even if I argue, or I shouldn't say argue, but even though I sucked at them, is the real crux of it. I was no good. Um, but it's, I can always appreciate when people love those games, because, they're technical marvels in terms of, the options presented to you. And, regardless of, and by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, but regardless, when every character has a quote unquote similar move set, they're not the same. So it's, even though someone is going to have a ranged attack, all ranged attacks aren't the same, and, all this fun stuff. And especially now, I believe, where um, they're more and more differentiating in how they function, I suppose is the way to say it.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. Like, I mean, just from a development perspective, it's crazy how I'm amazed at like how they continue to create not only the variety of characters, but the endless challenge of trying to balance the large assortment of characters, which is just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, exactly. And there's much that could be said to balancing games. And I think in the standpoint of a competitive game where it's a fighting game like that, balance is actually really important there. Where some games, for single player games, who cares if you're overpowered, right?
Right.
Let you have that power fantasy. That doesn't really work when you're playing against another person when they pick the power fantasy character and you don't.
Very much. Yeah. True.
And then, as well, action adventure 3D games, that's I understand what you're saying, in that, it's a weird, like the current iteration of it, I guess you'd say, because, back in the heyday, like you said, when Mario 64 came out and kind of defined the genre, and now we've had games that intentionally call back to that era in terms of what they're trying to do or what they're capable of doing, like Hat in Time or Ukulele, for example. It's I agree, because it's really weird that, you have games that are similar to them today, but it's it's hard to fully define and fully do it in the same way that, you can tell someone what a Zelda game is, but when it comes to then making that Zelda game, you quickly realize, well, no, it's went through so many iterations, and you're looking at it through the lens of, modern times. Same with, action adventure games like Mario 64 and such, that you can say, oh yeah, well, you do this, you do that, and it's going to be straightforward. But then in the actual implementation, it's very specific. And because of that, unfortunately, it's the ones that are going to give that same level of nostalgia are few and far between, as you yourself have already discovered, right?
Yeah. I mean, that is a dying genre. I expect, thank goodness for indie developers because you get some games that show up from time to time, but it's definitely a sort of a dying genre. Um, I think people have sort of lost interest in the whole idea of like I go to this open area and I'm just trying to figure out what's going on, and there's all these different mini puzzles and combined with platforming, um, which I think in general platforming, at least for mainstream Americana, in the world is kind of outside of a Mario, but even Mario, there is platforming, but they've sort of added a lot to more beyond just platform jumping and things like that. There's Mario has become sort of this more open world esque puzzle solving thing as well. Inspired by Mario 64, I'm sure. But yeah, it's sort of it's a dying genre. I think things have moved on to this sort of idea of open world kind of situation, more open world, this large scale, is like Zelda Breath of the Wild has obviously shown, for example. Um, and I think, and it's fine. I mean, some genres just don't resonate anymore and things like that. But, those types of games, those action platformer type of games really um, hit me, at the right time back in the day, even on PlayStation and things like that and N64. And they've always kind of stuck with me. And I've always loved that kind of game design. And so it does make me a little bit sad that it's there so far, few and far between now.
Yeah, and hopefully, we can see a resurgence. I'm sure that, with like we've seen with boomer shooters and such, that there probably is one that's right around the corner because I've seen some smaller indie ones or some larger indie ones that are having moderate success. So hopefully that's we're gonna hit a point where um, we have a resurgence of them because that would be absolutely great. Because I think a modern take on 20-year-old or whatever, however old those games are,
Right.
modern take on that would be a more modern take or more modern takes, I should say, would be fantastic. That way you're not, when you're looking for these games, you're not just limited to something like Hat in Time or Ukulele or the newer Demon Turf game, so to say, or for example.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Now, Stephen, I don't want to take up like a whole bunch of your time. It's Sunday. Like I said, I don't want to steal all your time on this Sunday morning. However, if you're okay, if I do have a few more questions to bother you with.
Definitely. Let's go. Let's go for it.
Awesome, awesome. So, you kind of touched on this, and I don't know if this is going to be something that uh, was already previously answered. So, by all means, if it was, feel free to give it the lightning round treatment, if you will. But what is it that makes gaming truly enjoyable to you?
For me, it's a couple of things. One is sort of it takes me out of the real world. I think that's the cliched sort of answer, but I make games for a living, but as with every other job or business, can be very stressful. Really, in the end, it is a business. There is something magical about whenever you're creating something that is, I guess, creative, for sure. You're putting a lot of yourself into it, and everyone who's involved is putting a lot of themselves into it. But deadlines, budgets, issues that rise up, it's very, very sort of stressful. So ironically, one of the ways I kind of step away from that is to play other games. And what's great about that is that I get a double benefit out of that. One is, I can escape from the real world for a little bit, but I can also learn while I'm playing it, like what works and what doesn't. I think that's awesome. Being able to do something that you enjoy and also learn while you're doing it is sort of a win-win. So for me, those are two of the sort of the main reasons. The third one is, I enjoy sort of the puzzle solving um, elements of games, especially clever puzzles, and sitting there trying to figure out, what I need to do next, and just kind of exercising the old noggin a little bit in different ways than I traditionally do in a normal workday, is always a sort of a wonderful thing. Um, but also, I like to spend a lot of time trying to play a broad variety of games, especially a lot of indie games, just to see what directions those games are heading in. There's a lot of creativity there. I mean, some might argue the greatest amount of creativity and uniqueness and innovation is coming from and has been coming from the indie scene. And so being able to find a really quirky type of new game that just heads in the direction that's completely unexpected or merges a couple of genres together in unique and interesting ways. It's always a fun kind of interesting component. So I kind of look for those really weird, quirky kind of games. I always love those kind of out of the normal type of experiences. So I think all that is combined together is what keeps me excited about games, and always wanting to try new ones. Now the limiting factor is just more so time than anything else.
And thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I can definitely relate to time being the biggest enemy of trying to enjoy, everything that is to offer. Um, I don't think anyone that is an adult, as they especially they get older or have children or what have you, the balance of life versus doing, gaming. And I don't want to say things you enjoy because obviously, you know, I think that's dismissive to everything else. But balancing, being all of the things that you enjoy starts to become a headache. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that, and I think everyone else can too. Now,
That's
speaking of, oh, sorry.
I was just going to add one thing, like, the unfortunate aspect, though, just talking about time, is that, um, I've had to sort of stop playing more of these as games have progressed onto these open world kind of designs in larger and larger scopes, and like 80 hour, 100 hour, 130 hours. It's like, I just don't have time to do that, and it's always been this case where like the 8 to 10 hour window for a game or experience has always been sort of ideal for me, especially now. And so I find myself, unfortunately, jumping between games a lot or moving on after I've gotten a good understanding or a decent understanding of an experience, just because there's so many games in my backlog. And, I want to see as much as I can, but obviously time is a limiting factor. So it's kind of like, oh, people enjoy games like Elden Ring or large scope games like that, open world kind of stuff. And I'm just like, I dare not even tackle that because it would probably take me 2 years before I even finish it.
Yeah, there isn't much to add to that other than yeah, I understand what you're saying, and yes, I think a lot of people can definitely relate to that. Me especially, or me as well. Sorry.
Yeah.
Now, Stephen, speaking of time, and balance, outside of gaming, outside of making games, playing games, what have you, what other hobbies do you have and enjoy?
I mean, yeah, bulk of my life is associated with games in some way. Like, obviously, the beyond just playing games, I think a lot of people at Digital Eclipse, just because of the sort of the aspect of us being doing a lot of things related to retro games, but we're all sort of big retro game collectors in some way or another, focus in different areas or whatnot. And so I think all of us enjoy the hobby of like, finding good deals on old games and collecting that stuff. I'm a big fan of just like, you know, console technology in general. So I have a lot of just old consoles or variations of consoles. I love collecting consoles, and have like, and I've got like 13 Saturns and like seven GameCubes and things like that. And so I just love the whole aspect of console hardware and how it's progressed in handheld hardware. And so part of my sort of side stuff that I'm doing to relax is, either modding older consoles or like upgrading handhelds, with new screens and new shells and things like that. And, I tackle that as I consider those weekend projects where like, oh, I have a Game Boy Advance that's all beat up. I'm like, let's replace that with new buttons and new membranes and shells and a new screen and things like that. And so that's another way that I sort of like stay within the whole games thing, but it's more of like a different, it's a physical exercise as well as a mental thing to try to piece this stuff together. So there's definitely that. I have two dogs, so I love hanging out with my two dogs, and I like to when I can, play board games. I have a decent collection of board games and enjoy kind of doing that and being a bit competitive on that side. And then, of course, as with a lot of people, just enjoy watching movies. You know, my employees and I just love movies in general, and so we chit chat a lot about movies and watching new series and things like that. So those are the main ways that I sort of pass the time.
Awesome. And just based on everything you said, I'm gonna hit you with a few quick follow-up questions there on that one. Um, Board games. If you were having, let's say, a group of four people come over and you're gonna be playing board games, what's gonna be your go-to board game?
Interesting. One of my favorite games that I always try to introduce people to is one called Last Night on Earth, and it's not an amazingly huge popular game, but it's well done. You know, it has a combination of like a board that you create, and it has little figures for zombies and humans. And the gist is simple. While there's a bunch of different scenarios, it's basically the humans against zombies, and half the players, well, depending on how many players you have, either half or maybe just one person plays all the zombies and the rest play humans. And it's literally just trying to survive until dawn, and trying to accomplish different scenarios, like, I have to find the gasoline and the keys in order to get to the car so that we can escape from the zombies. But it's just this fun thing because it's a combination of sort of co-op and competitive. You have the competitive nature of the zombies versus the humans. So there's that, but also the humans all have special abilities, and they need to work together to help each other out to defeat the zombies. So I love games where there is that component where it's not just everyone against everyone. It's sort of like there is the competitive nature of it, but there is also a cooperative aspect to it. I love that sort of dynamic, and I think that's one of the games that does that very well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that recommendation.
Sure.
Good words, I guess you would say to it. I enjoy playing board games when I have the time. Uh, Unfortunately, don't have a large enough space to play a lot of them because, as I'm sure you know, based on what you said, some of those games you need a
Oh yeah.
full dining table and not just like a little 3 or 4 seater, but like a full on, the extended families coming over for Thanksgiving table. So
Right, right. Yeah,
as you can,
it can get a little bit crazy. I kind of live vicariously through some of my folks that I know of, friends who have, a game board, like a board game room where they have shelves full of board games, and they have like dedicated, tables for that stuff. I've never gotten to that level, but they're like hardcore, you know, board game tabletop sort of fans, and so that's what their life, that's what they do. So I just live vicariously through them.
and I think at some point that is the best way to do it. To be like, well, I'm going to live through my friend who has the Frosthaven table, and then over here they have the Root table, then here they
Yeah.
have the Warhammer table or whatever, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Um, and speaking of collecting consoles, for some people, and I don't know if this is going to apply directly to you. However, I think you will have a statement on it. Um, just a smart, educated guess. But a lot of people might hear, you collect a lot of consoles and think, well, what does someone need, 5 GameCubes for? But back in the GameCube era, back before then as well, companies released awesome like awesome console tie-ins, special edition ones that came in like unique colors, or they came with like specific wraps or shell jobs or what have you. And I think that's really cool because I really loved uh, in when I was younger seeing all of like the Nintendo 64s and being upset that I just had the boring black one instead of like the atomic purple or the
Right.
whatever like the teal one was, or like I think there was a Donkey Kong one. And what I'm getting at though is for people that go like, well, why would someone have like 6 GameCubes? It's like, well, today, PlayStation releases a shell that you can snap on, or there are third-party companies that do, and that's kind of it. But back then, especially with something like a GameCube, because I don't think they're too expensive yet. Um, but like, it was an era where there weren't just one console and it wasn't just black or it wasn't just white. It was actually, you know, something that was worth looking at and being like, yeah, I have the orange one and the purple one. Oh, and I also have this special edition one that's, you know, wrapped or painted a specific way, right?
Totally. I mean, consoles today in the last while have been a little bit boring in that regard. I think maybe PS2, well, PS3, I think had a decent amount of, I mean, a relatively large number of different variations of it, and it kind of got slower with PS4. And nowadays, it's very, very safe. You don't see very any iterations yet of the consoles, but yeah, I mean, it was like that. There's a lot of variety in not only the colors, but versions. It's neat even from the PlayStation side to have like the large PlayStation 3, and then the mid slim, and then the super slim. Just to kind of see this evolution of consoles and how much they've been able to miniaturize it. So I'm just interested in it from that perspective too, from a technological perspective, but from a collector's edition. For the Saturn, I have so many Saturns because the Saturn is just one of my favorite game consoles, and so I just made it this kind of goal to try to collect every sort of iteration of it, which I'm getting close to, as a little side hobby thing. But for the most part, why I have at least two versions of every sort of classic console is that I'm ever fearful that, especially with the rising prices, that should one die, um, that I have a backup. And also, having a extra one or two also allows you to feel a little bit more comfortable modding them or doing stuff to them, because if you manage to destroy it or something happens, it's not a horrible thing. You still have a normal console as a backup to utilize.
Exactly. The moment you said the rising cost, I knew it was going to be some variation of you had a loaner system to cannibalize if need be, right?
Exactly. You kind of have to. It's gotten ridiculous now. It's almost to a point where like it's just slowed down collecting stuff a bit, because um, it's gotten so crazy.
Exactly. And this really kind of slides nicely into the last thing I wanted to bring up and kind of can easily tie into the final wrap up that we're going to have. But in terms of collecting games, what Digital Eclipse does is taking a bunch of those game collections or games and putting them into collections and making it easier for people to actually own all of those games. Like just quickly looking and rambling off, the Samurai Showdown collection, the Street Fighter collection that you worked on, I think the former one that you did. I don't know if this was Street Fighter. I don't know the order of operation. My apologies. But like there was the Mega Man Legacy collection, and then as well the Disney Classics collection, um, and then upcoming the I don't remember the proper name for it off the top of my head. And my apologies. But the Turtle collection, which is going to have basically, the entire Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, I believe, and then the Game Boys and such, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, speaking of going, the rising prices of collections, for people like me who maybe aren't as interested in having a full series, like the full Super Nintendo line or the full Neo Geo line, because that's crazy expensive, or what have you. What you guys at Digital Eclipse are working on and getting to work with, because these are fantastic um, series. I don't know the right word. I'm just going to go with series. Fantastic series that you're getting to work towards releasing or have released, because like it makes it so easy for people that um, want to have a physical version of, let's say, Aladdin for the Super Nintendo, and they don't want to have to go to eBay and order it and then find out the eBay person accidentally sent Aladdin to the wrong customer, or to the wrong person, and
Right.
then you have to back and forth with them as they hope that the person sends Aladdin back to them so that they can send it to you. And that's an entirely accurate statement that happened to me a few years back.
Sure.
So like being able to just go out and buy a Switch version or what have you, and say, yeah, I have it if I want to play it, right? Like it's great to know that exists, because you know there are alternatives. And I'm not saying this to try and downplay what you're doing, but I hear a lot of like the community being like, well, why release these collections, or why would they go to that extent, when you can just do X, Y, or Z? But it's like, they're the small minority. And I think for the large majority of people, they just want to be able to go out to like, Target, Walmart, Best Buy, wherever, and grab all of the Street Fighter games off the shelf in one small, easy, convenient package, go home and play them for a few hours, right? And,
Right.
you know, without spending like $400 or $500 or whatever the cost is to get all of those games. So, I think what you guys are doing or working, what Digital Eclipse is doing, I think is fantastic. And I don't know where I was going with that. Sorry, it just turned into me praising you guys.
Oh, no worries. I mean, sort of jump in here with some things, and I think I know the direction you were kind of headed in. Yes, I mean it goes. Obviously the folks who work at Digital Eclipse, myself included, love these older IPs and such like that. There is the part of it that is a preservation aspect, which is being able to preserve on modern platforms these older games, which now would either cost an exorbitant amount if you tried to collect them all, or come across with a myriad of legal loopholes that need to be overcome in order to try to put them into a collection. Um, but that's just the first step of it. The first step of it is just being able to get these games in the collection, right? And there's a variety of companies that sort of do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Even main publishers will release, okay, here's just a collection of 10 games from our past. That's what you get, right? We consider that just the first step of what we're doing. And in some ways, that is, not an even easy first step. In some ways, it is, but in other ways, like for SNK 40th collection, people just seem, oh, you've got a bunch of arcade games in a collection or whatever. But what they don't see is that, for example, some of the older games, like in SNK 40th Anniversary Collection, had sampled sounds. So on the arcade motherboards were stored sound files, voice files, that have never been replicated anywhere. No one's actually accurately captured those, as an example. And so we had to send people to Japan, to the small town outside of Tokyo, where this guy has collected arcade boards, and he had one of the few for one of the games. He had one of the last existing boards. Now, finding these boards is already difficult. The more difficult challenge was actually convincing him to send it to us, to allow us to properly record and extract the digital sounds and then send it back to him. Now, that's a level of trust for people that we don't quite know that we have to sort of overcome. So, that's why I always sort of chuckle in most cases where people are like, oh, these companies just throw a couple of ROMs in a collection. That's it. It's like, what you don't understand is that sometimes it can take like a month or two just to get access to someone to convince them. But the end result, like for example, in SNK 40th, is that we have arcade games that are the only place where you can accurately get a proper emulation with the proper audio anywhere, like period, in existence, outside of the actual mother, PCB arcade boards that almost are completely gone. So, I bring that up from the standpoint that, like, even sometimes step one, which is what the audience and the marketplace expects, is not as straightforward and easy as you think. So that's one example. Um, the next step that we try to do beyond that is to provide behind the scenes content that is, not readily accessible and freely available out there. And the reason we do that is that in the future, we want people to understand the significance of the games in the collection, why they are in the collection, right? And part of the way that you do that is through the ephemera of the stuff that was released with the game. So it's the advertising, the commercials or the reviews. But not only that, the behind the scenes content, such as design documents and early concept art and early interviews and things like that, help to inform and educate the public in general of why these games are the way they are and why they are important. And a lot of that stuff also is not very easy to find. I kid, but we sort of have to be this Indiana Jones and go on these archaeological explorations to dig through company vaults and to reach out to people who used to work at the company and then who knew another person who worked at the company who might have this or who might have a VHS tape. So there's a lot of time and effort spent into researching, finding these people and convincing them to allow us to copy or scan or use this stuff. And this is all the things. It's not like a company just sends us everything and we just put in there. That's rarely the case. In most cases, companies have very little because they never bother to save them. A lot of companies, this has, they've either lost it due to fires or other reasons, or they just never bothered to back it up because they never felt it was important. So you have to rely on people who kept this stuff, who used to work on the games, who have it on a hard drive or on a VHS tape, etc., floppy disks. Um, and we have to figure out ways to extract that information, especially if it's an old format on its something, like a side quest disc or something. So there's a lot of work that people don't see that goes into that step too. But during those phases is where we find a lot of the story, or we find some of the missing information that people weren't aware of, and that helps what informs some components of the collection. And that phase is very important because without it, we may not come across certain things. Like, for example, you mentioned the Samurai Showdown Neo Geo collection. There is a game in that collection, Samurai Showdown 5 Perfect, which up until we released it in the collection was never released publicly. It was never known by the vast majority of the world that that game ever existed. It was basically on test at an arcade in Japan for one day, and then it was pulled, and that was it. And then it disappeared from the earth, basically, at least from public awareness. We only found out about it by talking to team members who used to work at SNK and who worked on the Samurai Showdown team. And they said, oh yeah, we actually had this version of the game that was supposed to be the final Neo Geo game, the final Samurai Showdown game. And I think I have it, on a hard drive somewhere. And we're like, what? And through that whole sort of researching and working it out with SNK and things like that, and then meticulously restoring the English story aspects of that game and sort of finishing it from that part, we're able to release it, into the world. And that sparks other things, like people have ported that version of the game to actual Neo Geo cartridges, and you can actually buy it unofficially, in Asia. So I don't want to belittle things like that because that's a crazy thing. Like decades later, right? We finally released what will be the last and final Neo Geo game that most people weren't even aware of. So that's the second and very key component of these collections that we work on. The third aspect of it is sort of delivering on the intentions of the original development team, and I say that in a couple of ways. I say that in ways that we may include quality of life improvements. For example, you brought up Mega Man Legacy Collection. We added support to Mega Man Legacy Collection to overcome some of the limitations of the original NES platform. So the sprite shimmering, the slowdown and things like that, so that you can have an experience, and if you want to, these are always optional items. You can turn on that and then have an experience of Mega Man that the development team originally intended but weren't able to deliver because of limitations of the hardware. So that's sort of one example. Another sort of example that is an entirely different side of things is when we were talking to the original Aladdin development team about Aladdin and sort of the challenges that they had when they were working on Aladdin, they came up with things that they would have fixed if they could. Oh, the camera here, or the boss here, or this here. But they never had the time because it was a very short development cycle. Once you release something on cartridges, that's it. There's no idea or concept of patches or anything like that. And they say, our biggest regret that we heard when we were interviewing is like, oh, I wish I would have been able to do this, and I wish I'd been able to do this. So when we worked on the Disney Aladdin and Lion King collection, we went in and created a new version of Aladdin that fixed all the issues that the development team brought up in their interviews. And so, through all intents and purposes, the version of Aladdin that we include, or the special version that we include in that collection, is actually the definitive version of Aladdin based off of the desires of the development team. These are things that I think most people don't think about, or when these collections go out, they don't think about because there's a lot of work and time involved in it. But that's the extra 10% that we go after, right? And I think it's what helps to make our collections special. One last example of that is, including in a different way, in a way to educate people in Street Fighter collection on the Switch. Um, we were able to make a version of the tournament battle game that was released in arcades for a limited time, and very few people saw it in the United States, where four cabinets, or Street Fighter cabinets, Super Street Fighter 2 cabinets, were linked together in the arcades, and you could play in a tournament style experience where you'd actually physically move from arcade cabinet to arcade cabinet depending on how good you did in the tournament. And we always thought that that was an amazing thing that very few people got to experience. And so we decided that in the Street Fighter collection, we would add that to the Switch version because it made the most sense, because that's the platform that most people would have friends over and could technically make sense to hook up. And so you can actually have four Switch systems wirelessly connected, and you can replicate that tournament battle experience where you're moving from Switch to Switch, just like in the arcade. And that's another example of the way that we sort of try to preserve history and educate people about things that they may not have known about these games. And that's where a lot of our joy and our happiness comes from, sort of these projects. The fourth and sort of last thing that I feel is, we want to add quality of life components to these games, such as rewind to make it easier for people to be able to make mistakes and play them, for saving anywhere at any time so that you can just quickly go in. But that also fuels sort of the innovative things that we try to do with these collections, such as the watch movies or the replay movies. And that purely came out from the standpoint that, like, oh, how amazing would it be if someone could just watch an entire, a person who's pretty good at the game play through the entire experience of the game, even if it's just to get past the point that you might find problematic or challenging, and then be able to jump back into the game. And that's where the genesis of that feature came from, and is in a lot of our collections. So literally, you can load up, like, for example, I was just talking about Aladdin or something. You can load up a playthrough of me playing through Aladdin, and at any time, you can just jump into where it is and then just start playing from the standpoint. And that's how we sort of approach these collections. It's like, what, beyond just the games that are included in it, what are the things that help us to inform and educate people? What, in our exploration, what are some things that people may not know about these games, or the public in general is not aware of, and how can we educate people? And then how can we provide quality of life improvements to not only make the experience of playing these games more fun and easy, but also to allow them to overcome, or allow sort of the games to overcome the technical limitations that they may have had in the past, and then deliver on the actual desires and the original intent of the original development team. So those are sort of, in a long-winded way, sort of a lot of the goals and sort of things that we try to accomplish with these collections, and why I view they're not just a bunch of games that are thrown into a box. And hopefully people, as we've grown the number of fans and people who are aware of Digital Eclipse, and you mentioned the Turtles collection, which I think is going to be a large catalyst for more and more people being aware of Digital Eclipse and the Digital Eclipse brand, because the TMNT sort of IP, is a mass market IP. It reaches across all demographics and ages and things like that. And it's lasted for so long that it has touched most people in some way, whether you started with the comic books, or were interested in one of the animated series, or you played the games. But it is sort of this larger entity, and we wanted to sort of respect that. And while there was an amazing amount of positive excitement that came from the original announcement of Turtles, there's a lot more about this collection that has not been revealed yet, and I'm very excited when people get to see some of the other stuff that we've been able to include and accomplish for it. So hopefully people will stay patient and stay tuned. But I'm sure Konami, who's the publisher, will share information as they as they plan to, and you'll learn more about this collection in the months ahead.
And yeah, you've said a lot there. There isn't a lot I can speak to broadly, so don't mind me as I pick and choose certain things.
Sure.
But yeah, no, I agree completely, and thank you for elaborating further on. You were correct. Where the direction I was trying to go before I lost myself in my weird tale of trying to get an Aladdin cartridge some years ago. Um, but no, that was the direction I was trying to go, and thank you because it is good or hopeful, let me rephrase that. Hopefully, people start to realize what you're doing is not just dumping ROMs on, because it's good that these exist in a way that's not just the ROM, or they exist in, like you said, with Aladdin, where you guys went back and actually created the definitive edition based on what the developers wanted to originally do but couldn't. But also, like, just preserving and making available and all of that. And speaking to being unaware of Digital Eclipse, and I apologize, I am guilty of this. I didn't know the full catalog of everything you guys had worked on until I was preparing to speak with you, and even in the conversation here I missed some things. And it's really wild to see all of the things that you guys have actually been a part of, because it really speaks to you that it's not just, you guys jumped in on one or two games and you're just, lucked into Turtles. You guys have been doing this for several games and, doing your best to improve where improvements can be made or could be feasibly deserved, but at the same time trying to deliver an accurate rendition or accurate version to what, someone would have played as a child. And I think that's absolutely fantastic from both preservation standpoint, collection standpoint, and just a, being able to sit down and play a game standpoint. Because, you know, like I said, the vast majority of people, they're if they want to play an old game, like if they wanted to go out and play Lion King, for example, or Mega Man 4, or like Street Fighter 2 Turbo whatever edition. There are too many Street Fighter 2 editions, sorry. Or whatever, right? Like the challenge would be they'd have to physically get their hands on that specific version, or they'd have to go dig it out of the closet, or whatever, because the vast majority of people don't have collections of games sitting out, or they have a few, or they have a shelf, but the rest of them are stored somewhere, right? And it's just fantastic being able to do that because, or just grab a collection off the shelf in the sense of like a Switch cartridge or a PS4 disc or what have you, because it's just so much easier. And like for parents, for example, that might want to sit down with their kids and be like, yeah, when I was your age, this is what I played. They can just throw that in the console, and their child is now playing Aladdin and is then trying to play the Lion King and getting to the same frustrating moments that they had riding the ostrich and never realizing that Simba actually grows up in the game or what have you. Um, I just, again, I'm kind of rambling into getting lost here, but again, I think what you guys are doing, and thank you for allowing, because what I think you guys are doing is fantastic. And, I hope with the Turtle collection, like you said, that it gets you guys more recognition on the public standpoint so that people are aware of more of what you're doing and the broad scope of what it is that you're doing, and not just they're just, as you said, negatively saying they're just putting some ROMs on a cartridge and sending it out the door. um, because I mentioned this to you when I was before we were talking, um, way back when I first reached out to you, that one of the biggest things I was looking forward to was the Cowabunga collection, because I I don't own all these games, and I like these games. They're from my childhood. I played the hell out of them. And being able to now say I can just go and buy all of these games on a cartridge and play it on the Switch is so much easier and nicer for me than trying to track down all of these games. Um, and I can still do that if I want, but I don't have to worry about them being in full functional order or any of that. So I think it's just fantastic what you guys are doing. And I look
Yeah.
forward to it, and I hope that more recognition comes to you guys and that more people are aware of just how much work goes into the whole package, right?
It's a slow process. I mean, people there aren't a ton of companies, who do sort of what we do. I mean, there are other companies, but they probably not to, like I mentioned before, to the breadth of stuff that we do. And there's also a myriad of like folks who and publishers are sort of guilty of this too, of just literally like throwing some ROMs in a pot in a cartridge and throwing some random artwork that they have and calling it a day, right? And we're trying to overcome that sort of stigma and sort of negative connotation that happens with some of those collections. And we've been lucky enough to do things like before, like SNK 40th anniversary collection, which is like from a just a financial sort of standpoint. Like if you think about, if you're trying to pitch someone, say like, hey, we want to release a collection of games, arcade games, pre Neo Geo from SNK, so from the 1970s mainly. Like, who's going to really sign off on that? That's not something that really people say like, you know what, that's going to sell like gangbusters. But it was an amazing thing where like SNK were at a time that they wanted to sort of celebrate the history of their company. They trusted us, they knew us, and things like that. And they knew that this wasn't going to be a collection that was going to sell gangbusters. It's just inevitable. But they still wanted to do it from the preservation aspect, from the historic, aspect of like remembering the roots of where the company came from, right? And also, to as a tool for folks just to educate people about the early days of arcades and how SNK arcade games influence a lot of the games that you see in arcades, post that era. So I think that's an amazing thing, and being able to do that from a historical and educational aspect is amazing for sure. Turtles is like the other gamut of it, right? Where it's like from a social aspect is as widespread as you can possibly get, right? Like I mentioned earlier, but just the amount of like excitement and fervor that came from that announcement was amazing. Like I think we expected it to be well received, but not to that exorbitant level. And even Konami was taken aback by it. They were like, "Wow, like this reaction is staggering." And it's like you can see that even like we have these limited edition versions that got announced and they kept selling out. And I think they're about to be completely sell out now. But they sold out, and then Konami was like, "Oh my gosh, we got to make more." And then those sold out, and they said, "Oh, we got to make more," and they sold out, right? And so it's amazing. And thank you to everyone who's sort of messaged us about the collection, things like that. Thank you for just showing your excitement, anticipation for the project. It's been very exciting for us too. It's been it's a very big project. It's as with every other project, it has its challenges and things like that. But it's always great. And I mentioned this to you earlier. It's like you work so hard on a collection, and then when it's sort of well received or it impacts people in very positive ways or brings a smile on their face, all that effort and late nights, it makes it feel worth it.
And hopefully that continues to be the case for you guys. I don't, I don't. Wow, let me try this again. I rarely speak in negative terms on the podcast about about game stuff because I know that it's difficult, and I well I don't well I wow well I rarely speak negative terms on the podcast. I regardless always sincerely hope for the best of studios because in moments of frustration and such, it's easy to say mean things, even if it's to your, in the room, right? But outside of that, realistically, everyone should be aware of just how much work goes into making a game. And, even a game that they might not enjoy, a lot of people have went forward in that or what did a lot of late nights, like you said. And, you should always appreciate just the amount of work that's went into it. And I think, even if something's not for you, I think the best way to actually phrase that is just say, well, that wasn't for me, instead of trying to be mean about it, right?
Agree with that. You know, we understand that not every game is for everyone, and we understand that not every game goes out there perfect, right? And trust us, um, the unfortunate aspect of like working with Street Fighter or working with IPs like Turtles or things like that is that unfortunately, as a developer, um, generally all you see when you look at a collection release are the negative aspects or the things that are wrong with it, right? It's the what if I did this or should I have done this differently, right? And for the vast majority of people out there in the world, the 99%, they don't see any of that. It's a wonderful and enjoyable thing for them. But unfortunately, projects are all about making hard decisions and compromises and where to put resources and time. And so you always have that in the back of your head. Um, you know, that, oh, maybe you could have done this better, or maybe you should have done this instead, or maybe that was a mistake. So it's totally fine, and I accept, people's comments and feedback about collections. It's what helps to make us improve and be better. In most of those cases, we are painfully aware of the issues and things like that, and we know that, and we try to address it for the next time. But it never hurts. Like, I will always take feedback and suggestions for projects from the world at large. But like you said, there's no need to be sort of petty or ugly about it, or just make an unnecessary comment. Those are the worst kinds. Just to say just a very harsh, unnecessary comment for no reason, with no sort of way to in your brain to like fix it or address it. It's just a very negative comment, and those are the things that I just try to filter out. But if you have a legitimate feedback about a collection re-release and you have a suggestion for it or a way to improve it, I will always be open to that if you present it in a positive light. And that's all. Just respect the hard. For every game that's released, just respect all the team members that are involved with it and the late nights and the weekends, and know that they probably wanted to fix certain things but weren't able to due to whatever reasons. And just keep that in mind with you do when you do provide feedback. And we're good. We're good. Like I said, just present it in a positive way, and we'll be more than receptive to the feedback. But like I said, 9 times out of 10, we're probably painfully already aware of it, just because we're looking at the project every single day for a long time.
Exactly. Thank you for elaborating further on that. Now, Stephen, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I realize I might have stolen a little more than I originally signed you up for or
No
pitched to
problem. No
you.
problem. No problem.
However, if there's anything else you want to discuss, a cool game, what else you're doing, we have discussed a fair bit what you're doing, but if there was anything else you wanted to add to that, by all means, or something if you just feel more people should be aware of, the floor is all yours, as well as please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, which I'll also be including in the episode description.
Great. Yeah, no, I mean, basically, thank you for everyone who has been a Digital Eclipse fan for the years in the past. Digital Eclipse has been around for a while, but we focused on, even back in the early days, like the Xbox 360 and on PCs. Digital Eclipse brand was sort of the first kind of company to bring really emulation to the public as far as retail packaged goods, especially for the first time on the PC. We did a lot of the sort of one-off arcade games that you saw during the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, but that was a Digital Eclipse name. A lot of the different people, but some of the same people who are still here now. And then Digital Eclipse went away for a while, and then we came back with a new sort of idea of how we wanted to proceed. And Mega Man Legacy Collection was the first game to sort of represent that kind of general goal that we wanted to accomplish. And we sort of been trying to build the brand since that time. So wherever you joined us, if it was Mega Man or Street Fighter, or even we did a remake of Medieval, originally a PS1 game that we remade for the PS4. So we don't just do collections; we also do remakes and demakes and things like that. But I think most people know us for these collections. But wherever you joined us, thank you for coming along for the ride. We have a lot of stuff that we're working on now, and we're continuing to grow and things like that. So definitely appreciate all the support. And like I said, if you're a new fan who is just learning about Digital Eclipse through Turtles or whatever, welcome, and hopefully you'll stick around. We have a lot of exciting stuff planned for the future, and hopefully we can talk about it later this year. And yeah, I mean, as far as me, if you ever want to reach out to me, I'm on Twitter at Frostman 007, just like James Bond. And we are also, the company is on Twitter at Digital Eclipse. And if you want to reach out the company on Facebook, you can just search up Digital Eclipse and we'll show up there. So feel free to follow us and for future announcements. And also, if you want to find out more about the Turtles collection once we can talk about more, because there's a lot more planned for sure. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for coming along for the ride.
So, thank you for that. Again, that information will be included there. I personally am really looking forward to what else you guys have to announce for the Turtle collection because, well, I grew up I grew up in the eight or 90s, I'm was born in the 80s, so obviously the Turtles for me are 100% going to be a thing that I, as a middle-aged man, is trying to recapture my youth with.
Aren't we all? We're
So,
always trying to recapture our youth.
exactly. So I am really looking forward to that. So, and hearing more about what comes to that. But Stephen, uh, by all means, thank you so much for your time. If there wasn't anything else, I will let you get back to your day, though.
No, that should do it. Thanks again. Thanks for having me come on and chit chat a while. It was a great blast, and hopefully we can chat again in the future sometime.
Yeah, definitely. If there's an opportunity for it, always happy to talk games with people. Never gonna shy away from that.
Great.
So thanks again, Stephen, for making time to have this conversation with me, and thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast, as well as a special thanks to Rob Jenkins for the use of music from the title track from Road Steep. And if you like this podcast and want to support it and help it grow, please subscribe or follow me on Twitter at Red Tunic Podcast to receive the latest news and episode information. And be sure to share with those you think might also enjoy it. Thanks, and until next time. I'm just kicking the bots now. We're trying to.